where we're going to have 4 speakers that are going to tell us about, in Europe, what is going on to address these matters. And I was very happy to be able to get together a panel where we would have on one hand industry, on the other hand a regulator, also a legislator from the European Parliament, and finally someone that is having a leadership position in bringing together inspectors from a large number of agencies around the world, and we'll hear also what kind of global cooperation is going on there. So we start with Gerald Heddell from the UK agency. Gerald is the Director of the Inspection, Enforcement and Standards. No, sorry. He's Director of Inspection, Enforcement and Standards, Medicine and Healthcare Products in the UK Regulatory Agency. And his current responsibilities focus on the quality of medicines in the UK and include a comprehensive surveillance, inspection and enforcement program, the licensing of pharmaceutical manufacturers and wholesalers, oversight over defective medicines reporting, unlicensed imports, borderline products, medicines testing, and the British Pharmacopoeia. Gerald.
Well, thank you, Guy, for that welcome and introduction. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here. It's a delight to be able to support Rx-360. You've grasped the nettle, as it were. You've understood a problem and you're seeking to do something to address it. And I think seeking to do so with some real measure of success. So congratulations to Rx-360. It's a delight to be with you today. As was said, I'm employed by the UK regulators for medicines, medical devices and blood. What I'm going to seek to do very briefly, and I want to keep it fairly brief so that we have plenty of time for discussion and debate at the end of this session, is to give some overview of the Falsified Medicines Directive and also the extent to which it's been successfully implemented across Europe. We have already been reminded of the issues relating to fake medicines in a global market. Fake products are a fact of life in the world in which we live. But medicines, I would argue, are unique in many ways. Unlike fake Nike trainers or fake Rolex watches, and I'm not wearing a fake Rolex watch, the customer is often unable to detect the fake, in fact almost always unable to detect. And even the effects of taking an ineffective or potentially dangerous medicine are not known necessarily by the patient at the time when they take it. So they're dependent on us, industry and regulators, to safeguard their interests. Last year I conducted a very quick review of press reports from throughout the world. And it won't surprise you to realise my conclusion that there's no continent, there's no country that is really escapes the threat of fake medicines in today's world. This gentleman has already been portrayed. This is Leroy Hubley, whose wife and son were tragically killed by the use of the adulterated heparin. Very much a milestone event, this adulteration of heparin in 2008. They were being treated for given dialysis for a congenital kidney disease, and the very treatment was intended to preserve their lives, took their lives tragically from them. He gave evidence to a congressional subcommittee. But there were lessons that came from that incident, lessons which I think were actually foundational in the establishment of the Falsified Medicines Directive that I'm going to describe briefly. The need for there to be a better knowledge of the supply chain. In the case of heparin, we were talking about no less than 1 billion pigs throughout China. A difficult, a complex supply chain, but one that was barely understood until the issue emerged. The need for the risks to be properly assessed in order that they might be managed. Where it's appropriate for there to be product specifications that may help. In the case of heparin, I think it's hard to imagine that would have been possible to have a test that would look for something that was really not intended to be there. And the need, as we've been discussing with Rx-360, to have a greater involvement with suppliers. The risks of counterfeit medicines are pretty obvious to us all. The active ingredient, if it's there at all, may be in the wrong quantity. It may not be there at all. We even had one case where there was a comparator used in a clinical trial. Now, that has real effects on the ultimate conclusions that are made from that trial. But inevitably, there will be unknown impurities within a medicine that is a fake, and there are likely to be contaminants. So there is no such thing as a safe fake medicine. I use the word fake with the because I don't want to try to remember what SSFFC stands for, but you all understand. Something that's not as it is intended to be, without necessarily bringing it into the sphere of trademark issues. And the underlying issue with fake medicines is that one of the most important factors we have in terms of treating patients, namely their confidence in medicines, is undermined. And this can have enormous impact on compliance with their therapy, and indeed in many cases actually has harmed health and caused fatalities. But even for industry, there's not only those public health issues, but there is also damage to what is perhaps the most important, perhaps next to the R&D pipeline for innovative companies, but one of the most important assets, namely your reputation. So it was that the Falsified Medicine Directive was envisaged, and in the middle of 2011 it was adopted by the European Parliament and published. And from the beginning of this year, 2013, it is being progressively implemented. And that implementation will actually continue in some countries on until 2020, with the Delegated Act on Security features for countries that already have something in place. So just briefly, there are, as you're aware, 4 main components to the Falsified Medicines Directive. And I'll just mention them briefly and refer to some of the progress that's been made with implementation. Firstly, and perhaps most controversially, the area of active pharmaceutical ingredients. The principle is whether the ingredient is manufactured, distributed, or imported in Europe, that it should be to an equivalent standard. That's the principle behind this. And the Falsified Medicine Directive ensures that, or requires, that they comply with appropriate standards of good manufacturing and distribution practice. And it also requires explicitly that manufacturers engage themselves in audits of their suppliers. Now the MHRA has required that for some years, evidence of that, but it has also recognised, as is recognised in the Falsified Medicines Directive, that this can be undertaken by a third-party auditor. And Rx-360 has a major contribution to make in the provision of such audits. And all of these operators, the manufacturers, the distributors, and the importers, need to be registered with their local country's regulatory authority. The most controversial relates to this active substance requirement. And the baseline requirement, which most of you are aware, is that there should be a written confirmation from the country of origin for that particular active substances, from their regulatory authority. That's the baseline position. But there are some waivers. The first waiver is that country has been deemed by the European Commission, following an assessment, to be operating to an equivalent standard of GMP and to have systems of reporting issues that may occur. That's the first waiver. And the second waiver, which you need to read the wording, is meant to be an exceptional waiver in certain circumstances of critical need. And that waiver is that there should be a GMP certificate based on an inspection by a European competent authority, by the regulatory authority of a European member state. So, as we approached July the 2nd, we were in trepidation. This time last year, I was personally quoted, I think, for saying that there were 1,200 suppliers of active substances from third countries that supplied the UK alone, and what was going to happen 6 months later. Was the world going to end? Was medicine supply as we know it not to continue as a result of this provision? Perhaps that's an extreme view, but there was certainly a bomb that was ignited and was likely to cause great damage. And the question remained is, could we defuse that bomb? Could action be taken that would actually remove this threat? Well, the MHRA took an initiative on behalf of Europe, which was to open a database and an electronic portal that sought information from all then 27 member states throughout Europe on exactly how many APIs, active substances, there were from how many countries, and we sought also to validate that information to remove duplicates. And the results of that exercise were that there were some 1,600 active substance suppliers from 42 countries that were identified. A big issue. But you might note that 85% of them are from, perhaps more than 85% actually, are from 5 countries, which I guess are no surprise to you. India, China, US, Japan and Switzerland were the key suppliers. And it was this information that allowed us as individual countries, but also the European Commission, to put a lot of energy into seeking to make sure that these key suppliers were on board with the requirements of the Falsified Medicines Directive. And that took place. So it left us with some key questions. How many countries would be providing written confirmations? How many countries would be whitelisted, would actually be seen to be equivalent and therefore not need written confirmations? What inspection requirement would there be from regulatory authorities and how would it be met? And I suppose the overriding question is, would there be supply disruptions that would arise from this situation? Well, just briefly, this was the situation in July. There's been one update since then, and I think the only change really is that Russia has undertaken to provide written confirmations. But what you have here is just over 70% of the total manufacturers are now located in countries where there is a provision for written confirmations. In terms of the first waiver, the whitelisting, to date, 4 countries which are responsible for the over 25% of the total manufacturers have been deemed to be equivalent and are therefore whitelisted. And as we speak, Singapore and Brazil are being assessed. But both of them, if they are unsuccessful, have undertaken to provide written confirmations. So their numbers are still in the fray, which means, in effect, that the vast majority, some 97, 98% of all manufacturers are located in countries where there is a provision for either the written confirmations or for the whitelisting. As far as the second waiver is concerned, I think it needs to be understood that there's not been, as there has been in the US, there's not been a European obligation on regulators. There's been no mandated requirement for regulators to inspect active substance manufacturers. And therefore, European regulators are generally not resourced with this in mind. This was never envisaged. And so this has to remain an exceptional provision of the issuing of a GMP certificate on the basis of a European inspection. What has taken place on a weekly basis is that the European Medicines Agency has organised a telephone conference which seeks, on a weekly basis, every Friday, to assess whether there is some urgent, critical need that needs to be responded to by an emergency, an urgent inspection. And as far as I am aware, to date there have been 7 such inspections triggered, and I'm not sure that all 7 of them were that urgent. Some of them were reasonably able to be fitted in the future. So it's had very little response on this second wave. But moving on, if I may, just very briefly to the other provisions of the Falsified Medicines Directive. Excipients. There is a requirement that they apply, that you apply appropriate GMP, and that there is a formal risk assessment. And there has been a working party from the Inspectors Working Group, which is made up of representatives from across all European member states and coordinated by the European Medicines Agency. There's been a working party who have drafted guidance on these provisions. That guidance was reviewed by the last meeting of the Inspectors Working Party just a week or 2 ago. It will, I think, be completed in terms of its sign-off at their next meeting, and my expectation is that early in the new year this will be published. But the draft has already, I think, been made available, and it covers these areas. Moving on to the next part of this jigsaw, and its actors in the supply chain. Wholesale dealers have always been, or have been in recent years, regulated across Europe. What is new is that there will be a European database for such wholesale dealers, and there will be the requirement for GDP to apply to all of their activities that take place in Europe. So, for instance, product that is imported for export to another country is subject to this requirement. And the most important requirement is the last one. If wholesale dealers receive an offer which is too good to be true, they must assume that it is too good to be true, and they have a legal obligation to report that to the regulatory authority in their own country. The next group that have been included in regulation, that have previously been outside the radar of regulators, are these people who manage deals but don't actually handle the product, so-called brokers. And brokers now are required to be regulated, to be registered with their local national authority, and they have obligations that in many ways are similar to wholesale dealers. So, in summary, manufacturers, importers and distributors will have to be registered and apply appropriate standards of GMP and GDP. The third piece in the jigsaw, and just briefly mentioning this, if you want to obtain a counterfeit medicine today, the place to get it is on the internet. And the chances, if you deal with an unregistered internet site, are quite high that you will get a counterfeit product. So the customer, the patient, needs to know, is it a legitimate wholesale, a legitimate pharmacy site on the internet? And the provision that is in the Falsified Medicines Directive is a means of identifying that. In the UK, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain introduced such a scheme some years ago with a green cross that can be related back to a database that they maintain. That will be agreed next year, 2014, for implementation within 12 months. So that's an imminent decision that needs to be made and seems to me to be pretty self-evident. The final piece in the jigsaw is safety features. The Falsified Medicines Directive has a provision for both tamper-evident features and for serialisation that will allow for products to be traced through the supply chain. Now, this is a so-called delegated act, which means that at the time when the Falsified Medicines Directive was first adopted, the details are not agreed. Those details will be agreed next year, 2014, and the requirement will be for implementation within 3 years for most countries, unless those countries already have some provision in place which is similar, in which case it could be 3 years later, hence the original comment regarding 2020. So, just in conclusion then, my conclusion is that the Falsified Medicines Directive has a real beneficial impact on the safeguarding against falsified medicines. The implementation is largely on track. Amazingly, and I have to say as someone who is very concerned, amazingly supply issues appear to have been almost entirely averted. You may say something different, and I'd be interested to hear the discussion later. The whitelisting activity is continuing. I believe there is a need to work harder on confirming the actual confidence we have in the written confirmations. We have some understanding, and I'm personally involved with certain countries like China and India in regard to this. We have some understanding of how they are issuing these written confirmations, but the more confidence we can have, the more meaningful they will be in reality, rather than just ticking a box in terms of meeting the directive's requirement. There are key decisions next year, I mentioned, on the security features and on the internet logo. Possibly one of the most important issues is that I think this is leading us to more of an equivalence globally in terms of active substance, particularly active substance standards. We already have ICH Q7A, which has set some standards, but the applicability of those and the compliance with those is being, I think, encouraged by what's been done in the Falsified Medicines Directive. A final word is that the oral QP responsibilities have not gone away, and they are paramount. There is nothing in any of this which changes the need of the QP to understand and to be able to verify the supply chain and the legitimacy and the quality of the product that they are responsible for releasing to market. Hopefully this will support them, but this doesn't diminish their overall responsibilities, which I think is something that we all share, namely that patients should get, as has already been said by Brian and by Guy, that the patient should get a product in which they can be confident and it does precisely what it's expected to do. So thank you for your attention.